somewhere in the heart of the African continent, far south of the deserts that most people picture when they think of Egypt. A river begins its long and quiet journey northward. This is the Nile, and before there were pharaohs, before there were pyramids, before there was any word for Egypt at all, there was simply this slow-moving water, finding its way through highlands and marshes, gathering strength from distant rains, and carrying with it the possibility of life. Tonight, we are going to follow that river. Not quickly, and not all at once, but the way the river itself moves, patiently, over a very long stretch of time. We will let the story unfold the way the water does, one gentle bend after another, and there is no need to hold onto every detail. You can simply let the images and the words move past you, like the current itself, while your mind begins to settle and your body begins to rest. The Nile is often described as two rivers joining into one. The White Nile begins near the Great Lakes region of East Africa, flowing out of wetlands and slow-moving channels, drifting north through what is now Uganda and South Sudan. The Blue Nile begins in the highlands of Ethiopia, where seasonal rains swell its banks each summer and send a rush of fresh water and rich dark silt down toward the north. These two rivers meet at Khartoum, in modern-day Sudan, and from that point onward, they travel together as one single Nile, moving steadily toward the Mediterranean Sea. For thousands of years before anyone built a temple or carved a hieroglyph, this river simply did what rivers do. Each year, as the rains fell in the distant Ethiopian highlands, the water level in the Nile would begin to rise. Slowly, gently, the river would spread beyond its usual banks, moving out across the flat land on either side, covering the fields with a thin layer of water, and a fine dark soil carried all the way from the mountains far to the south. When the water receded, it left behind this dark, fertile soil, soft and rich, perfect for growing things. The ancient Egyptians would eventually call their own land Kemet, which means the Black Land, referring to this dark and fertile soil left behind by the flood. Beyond the reach of the water, the desert stretched out in every direction, pale and dry, and they called that land Deseret, the Red Land. The contrast between these two colors, the black fertile strip and the endless red desert on either side, would shape almost everything about how life unfolded here. It is worth simply sitting with that image for a moment. A narrow ribbon of green and black, sometimes only a few miles wide, running for hundreds of miles through an otherwise empty desert. Nearly all of ancient Egyptian life happened within this narrow strip, close to the water, close to the fields that the flood made possible. Everything else, the temples, the tombs, the cities, grew up along this single thread of river, because without it, none of it could have existed at all. Before there was any organized society here, small groups of people were already drawn to the Nile's banks. Hunters and gatherers moved through the region long before recorded history, following herds of animals, gathering wild grains, fishing in the shallow waters where the river slowed and pooled. The climate here was not always as dry as it is now. Thousands of years ago, much of what is now the Sahara Desert was actually a savanna, dotted with lakes and grasslands, capable of supporting animals like giraffes and elephants, and the people who hunted them. Slowly, over many centuries, the climate began to shift. The rains that once fell across this wider region became less frequent, and the grasslands began to dry out and turn to sand. As the desert crept outward, people who had once lived more widely across the region began to retreat toward the one reliable source of water they could count on, the Nile itself. This slow migration, spread across many generations, is part of what eventually concentrated so many communities along the riverbanks, setting the stage for everything that would follow. By around 7,000 years before our own time, small farming villages had begun to appear along the Nile. The people in these villages were learning to work with the rhythm of the river rather than against it. They planted their crops after the annual flood receded, taking advantage of the soft, moist, nutrient-rich soil the water left behind. They grew grains like emmer wheat and barley, which could be stored and used throughout the year, providing a kind of security that hunting and gathering alone could not offer. This shift toward settled farming changed the pace of life itself. Instead of following animals across open land, families began to stay in one place, tending their fields, watching the sky for signs of the coming flood, and building simple homes from mud brick, a material made from the very soil the river provided. Over time, these small settlements grew into larger communities, and communities began to develop their own customs, their own local leaders, their own ways of understanding the world around them. It is easy, when thinking about a civilization as famous as ancient Egypt, to imagine that it simply appeared, fully formed, with pyramids already standing and pharaohs already ruling. But civilizations do not arrive that way. They accumulate slowly, the way a river builds a delta, one small deposit after another, over thousands of years. The story we are following tonight moves at that same unhurried pace, because that is simply how it happened. As you rest here, listening to the sound of this narration, you might picture the river as it once was, quiet, wide, moving steadily northward beneath a warm and open sky. Reed boats drift near the shore. Small figures move along the banks, tending narrow plots of land. There is no rush in this scene, no sense of urgency. There is only the steady, patient rhythm of the water, rising and falling with the seasons, the same rhythm that would eventually give rise to one of the longest lasting civilizations in human history. In the segments that follow, we will move gradually through this long story, tracing how these early riverside communities grew into towns, how towns grew into two distinct kingdoms, and how those two kingdoms eventually came together as one. We will walk slowly past the building of the Great Pyramids, through long centuries of quiet daily life, past golden ages and gentle declines, all the way to the final chapters of ancient Egyptian civilization, thousands of years later. For now, though, it is enough simply to picture the river, to imagine its dark, fertile banks beneath a soft evening light, its slow current carrying silt and sediment from faraway highlands down toward a sea that would one day connect this land to the wider world. Everything that came after began here, with water moving gently across a wide and open valley, patient and unhurried, exactly the way we will continue this story together. Let your breathing settle into that same unhurried pace. There is nowhere you need to be, and nothing you need to remember. The river will keep flowing gently through the rest of this story, whether you are awake to hear every word or not. As we continue our slow journey along the Nile, we move now into a time when small farming villages were beginning to grow into something a little larger, a little more organized, though still very far from the great civilization that would eventually rise here. This period, which historians often call the pre-dynastic era, unfolded over roughly 2,000 years, long before the first pharaoh ever wore a crown. It helps to picture the Nile Valley during this time as a scattering of small communities spread out along the riverbanks, each one shaped by its closeness to the water. In the south, in a region we now call Upper Egypt, villages grew up around fertile bends in the river. Further north, where the Nile fans out into a wide, marshy delta before reaching the sea, other communities settled among the reeds and shallow waterways of Lower Egypt. It can feel a little counterintuitive at first, but in Egypt, Upper Egypt refers to the southern part of the country because the land there sits at a higher elevation, while Lower Egypt refers to the northern delta region, where the land is lower and closer to sea level. One of the earliest well-documented cultures from this period is often called the Badarian culture, named after a site called El Badari in Upper Egypt. The people who lived here around 6,000 years ago were already skilled farmers and herders. They kept cattle, sheep, and goats, and they grew wheat and barley in the soil left behind by the annual flood. They also made simple pottery, thin-walled and often polished to a soft, warm sheen, and they buried their dead with small offerings, suggesting an early belief that some part of a person continued on after death. Following the Badarian period, a series of cultures grew up around a site called Naqada, and archaeologists often refer to this broader era as the Naqada period. Over the centuries that followed, from roughly Naqada I through Naqada III, we can see, through the objects left behind, a slow and steady increase in complexity. Pottery becomes more decorated, sometimes painted with images of boats, animals, and human figures. Graves become more elaborate, with wealthier burials containing more goods than simpler ones, suggesting that some form of social distinction, some early sense of status and hierarchy, was beginning to take shape. It is worth pausing here to imagine what daily life might have felt like in one of these villages. Mornings would likely have begun early, before the heat of the day set in, with families tending to their small plots of land or their animals. The rhythm of the year would have been dictated almost entirely by the Nile itself. There was a season of flooding, when the fields lay underwater and farming was not possible. A season of planting, once the water receded and left behind its dark, fertile soil, and a season of harvest, when the grain was gathered and stored before the cycle began again. During the flood season, when the fields could not be worked, people likely turned to other tasks. This may have been a time for building, for making pottery, for trading goods with neighboring villages, or simply for rest and community gathering. Some historians believe that this seasonal rhythm, with its built-in periods of both intense labor and quieter downtime, may have given early Egyptian society some of the stability and structure that allowed larger, more organized communities to develop. Trade also played a growing role during this period. Villages along the Nile were not isolated from one another. Boats made from bundled papyrus reeds and later from wood carried goods up and down the river, connecting communities that might otherwise have had little contact. Evidence suggests that materials like obsidian, certain shells, and other goods traveled along trade routes stretching well beyond the Nile Valley itself, connecting early Egypt to distant regions, including parts of the Near East. As villages grew, some began to take on a more central role, drawing in trade, resources, and population from smaller surrounding settlements. Sites like Hierakonpolis and Nakata itself grew into larger towns with more organized layouts, larger buildings, and what appear to be early forms of local leadership. It is during this time that we begin to see evidence of individual rulers or chieftains who may have controlled a single town or a small cluster of nearby settlements. Religious life was also beginning to take shape during this period, though in forms quite different from the elaborate temple worship of later Egyptian history. Early Egyptians appear to have honored a variety of local gods, often associated with animals that were significant to their particular region, such as falcons, cattle, or crocodiles. Burial practices suggest a belief in some form of continued existence after death, with grave goods, including pottery, tools, and personal items that the deceased might need in whatever came next. By the later part of the pre-dynastic period, sometime around 5,300 years ago, we can see a gradual consolidation taking place. Smaller settlements were being absorbed into larger ones, and evidence suggests that a handful of powerful towns in Upper Egypt, particularly Hierakonpolis, Nakata, and Abydos, were competing for regional influence. This was not a sudden event, but rather the slow accumulation of power in fewer and fewer hands, a process that would eventually lead to the unification of the entire Nile Valley under a single ruler, a story we will follow in the next part of our journey. It is worth noting how much can be learned from what people leave behind, even without written records. The The pottery, the tools, the burial sites, the small painted images on ceremonial objects. All of these give us a quiet window into a world that existed long before anyone wrote down a single word of history. Everything we know about this period comes from careful, patient study of these physical remains. Much like the way our story tonight moves slowly, piecing together a picture from small, gentle details rather than dramatic events. As this segment draws to a close, picture once more the riverbanks at dusk. Small mud brick homes cluster along the water's edge. Cattle rest in shallow pens. Somewhere nearby, a potter shapes wet clay by hand, turning it slowly, the way the river itself turns and bends across the valley floor. There is no rush in this world, only the steady turning of seasons, one flood, one harvest, one quiet season after another, each one laying the groundwork very gradually for everything that is still to come. We continue now to follow the Nile northward, and with it, the slow story of a moment that historians often treat as a turning point, though in truth, like everything else in this story, it likely unfolded gradually over many years, rather than all at once. This is the story of how Upper and Lower Egypt, the southern river valley and the northern river delta, came to be understood as a single, unified land. By around 5,100 years ago, the competing towns of Upper Egypt that we spoke of earlier had been gradually consolidating into a smaller number of larger, more powerful centers. Among these, a town near what is now Abydos appears to have risen to particular prominence. And it is here that we find evidence of some of the earliest rulers who may have controlled the entire southern portion of the Nile Valley, from somewhere near modern Aswan all the way north toward the beginning of the delta. The most famous name associated with the unification of Egypt is Narmer, whose story is told, at least in part, through a remarkable carved stone object known as the Narmer palette. This palette, a flat piece of siltstone carved on both sides with images and early hieroglyphic symbols, shows a figure believed to be Narmer, wearing the tall white crown associated with Upper Egypt on one side, and the distinctive red crown associated with Lower Egypt on the other. Many historians interpret this as a symbolic, and perhaps also literal, representation of the joining of the two lands under a single ruler. It is worth taking a moment to sit with the significance of this symbol, the double crown, later known as the Peshent, combining the white crown of the south and the red crown of the north into one. For the remainder of ancient Egyptian history, spanning thousands of years, pharaohs would continue to be associated with this idea of ruling over two distinct lands brought together as one. Egyptian kings would often be described using titles that reflected this duality, such as Lord of the Two Lands, a phrase that appears again and again throughout the long history we are following tonight. Whether Narmer achieved this unification through military conquest, through gradual political alliance, or through some combination of both, remains a subject of ongoing study. And the honest answer is that we do not know with certainty. What we do know is that sometime around this period, the historical record shifts from a landscape of competing regional centers to one increasingly organized under a single ruling authority, marking what historians now call the beginning of dynastic Egypt and the start of what is known as the early dynastic period. With this new unified rule came a need for a capital, a central place from which a king could govern both the southern valley and the northern delta. Tradition holds that a city called Memphis was founded near the point where Upper and Lower Egypt meet, close to where the Nile begins to fan out into its delta. Memphis would go on to remain one of the most important cities in Egypt for thousands of years, serving at various points as a political, religious, and cultural center, even long after the seat of royal power had shifted elsewhere. The early dynastic period, covering the first and second dynasties, was a time of gradual institution building. Writing, which had already begun to develop in a simple form during the late pre-dynastic period, became more established, used for recording things like royal names, tax collection, and religious dedications. The idea of kingship itself began to take on a more formalized, almost sacred character, with the ruler increasingly seen not simply as a powerful chief, but as a figure connected to the divine order of the universe itself. During this period, the Egyptians also began to develop many of the artistic and architectural conventions that would define their civilization for millennia to come. Tomb building became more elaborate, particularly for royalty and high officials, with early structures known as mastabas, flat-topped rectangular buildings made of mud brick, constructed above underground burial chambers. These mastabas were the ancestors of the Great Pyramids that would follow in the centuries after, though at this stage they remained comparatively modest in scale. Religious beliefs during the early dynastic period continued to develop as well, drawing together local gods from different regions into an increasingly interconnected set of beliefs. As Upper and Lower Egypt merged politically, so too did many of their religious traditions, with certain deities rising to greater prominence as protectors of the newly unified kingdom. The falcon god Horus, in particular, became closely associated with kingship itself, with each ruling pharaoh understood to be, in some sense, a living embodiment of Horus on earth. It is easy, from a great distance of time, to think of unification as a single dramatic event, a battle won, a crown placed upon a single head, and the story finished. But the reality, as best as we can understand it through the slow and patient work of archaeology, was far more gradual. Political structures took generations to solidify. Regional identities did not simply disappear, but rather were woven slowly and carefully into a broader sense of shared Egyptian identity. one that still honored the distinct character of the North and the South, even while celebrating their union. As we picture this period settling into place, we might imagine the Nile itself as a quiet witness to all of it, flowing steadily past the growing city of Memphis, past newly built mastabas rising from the desert edge, past officials recording grain harvests and tax records in an early, evolving script. The river did not change with the rise of kingship. It continued its same slow rhythm of flood and recession, planting and harvest, exactly as it always had, indifferent to the political changes unfolding along its banks, and in many ways, still the true source of everything that made this civilization possible in the first place. In the segment that follows, we will move further along this timeline into the Old Kingdom, a period often remembered for its extraordinary building projects, including the very first pyramids. But for now, we can simply rest in this quieter moment, the slow coming together of two lands into one, a joining that would echo through every chapter of Egyptian history still to come. We move now into a period that many people associate most closely with ancient Egypt, a time often called the Old Kingdom, spanning roughly from the 3rd through the 6th dynasties, a period of several hundred years during which some of the most extraordinary building projects in human history were undertaken along the banks of the Nile. Our journey through this period begins with a ruler named Djoser, who reigned during the early part of the 3rd dynasty. Djoser is remembered today largely because of a remarkable structure built for him near the city of Memphis, in a burial ground known as Saqqara, rather than a simple mastaba like the tombs of earlier rulers. Djoser's tomb was designed as something entirely new, a series of stone platforms stacked one on top of another, each one slightly smaller than the one below, rising in 6 distinct steps toward the sky. This is the step pyramid of Djoser, widely considered the earliest large-scale monumental structure built entirely of stone anywhere in the world. The design of this remarkable building is credited to a man named Imhotep, who served as an official and architect under Djoser's rule. Imhotep's reputation would grow so significant over time that many centuries after his death, he came to be honored almost as a legendary figure, associated with wisdom, medicine, and architecture, and eventually even worshipped as a minor deity in his own right. It is a quiet but remarkable thing to consider how one architect's innovation, stacking stone platforms into a stepped pyramid, would go on to inspire an entirely new tradition of monumental building that would define Egyptian civilization for the following centuries. From this beginning, pyramid building continued to evolve. Rulers who followed Djoser experimented with different pyramid shapes and construction techniques, gradually working toward the smooth-sided, true pyramid form that most people picture today. One important step in this evolution came under a king named Sneferu, who ruled at the very beginning of the Fourth Dynasty. Sneferu is credited with building several pyramids during his reign, including what is known as the Bent Pyramid, whose sides begin at a steep angle before shifting to a gentler slope partway up, likely the result of engineers adjusting their approach partway through construction. And later, the Red Pyramid, considered the first successful true, smooth-sided pyramid ever completed. It was Sneferu's son, a king named Khufu, who would go on to build what remains the largest pyramid ever constructed, the Great Pyramid of Giza, rising to an original height of roughly 146 meters, constructed from over 2 million individual blocks of stone. The Great Pyramid stood as the tallest human-made structure in the entire world for more than 3,000 years, a record unmatched by any other building until the modern era. It is worth simply sitting with that fact for a moment, allowing it to settle. For 3,000 years, longer than the entire span of time separating us today from the fall of the Roman Empire, this single structure remained the tallest thing that people had ever built. The construction of the Great Pyramid remains, even today, a subject of careful study and gentle debate among historians and engineers. We know that the project involved organizing tens of thousands of workers, quarrying and transporting massive stone blocks, some weighing several tons each, and coordinating this labor over a period of roughly 20 years. For a long time, popular imagination pictured this labor force as enslaved people working under harsh conditions. But archaeological evidence, uncovered in recent decades, including the remains of a nearby workers' village, suggests a somewhat different picture. Many of the workers appear to have been paid laborers, organized into work crews, with names suggesting pride in their labor, provided with bread, beer, and meat as part of their compensation, and buried upon their deaths in tombs near the pyramid itself, an honor unlikely to have been extended to enslaved workers. Following Khufu, other rulers of the Fourth Dynasty continued building pyramids at Giza, including his son Khafre, whose pyramid, though slightly smaller than his father's, appears taller due to being built on higher ground, and whose complex includes the Great Sphinx, a massive limestone statue with the body of a lion and a head believed by most historians to represent Khafre himself. The third major pyramid at Giza, smaller still, was built for a king named Menkaure. Together, these three pyramids, along with their surrounding temples, causeways, and smaller subsidiary structures, formed one of the most ambitious building projects ever undertaken by any civilization in human history. Beyond the pyramids themselves, the Old Kingdom was a period of significant development in Egyptian government, religion, and daily life. The office of vizier, essentially the pharaoh's chief administrator, became increasingly important, overseeing the complex bureaucracy needed to manage such enormous building projects, collect taxes, and administer justice across the growing kingdom. Religious beliefs continued to develop as well, with the sun god Ra rising to particular prominence during this period, and the pharaoh increasingly understood as Ra's son, a divine ruler bridging the world of gods and the world of ordinary people. For most Egyptians during this time, daily life continued to revolve around the same rhythms that had shaped life along the Nile for centuries before. Farmers planted and harvested according to the flood cycle. Villages produced pottery, textiles, and tools, much of it destined either for local use or for the enormous royal building projects taking shape nearby. Skilled craftspeople, including sculptors, painters, and jewelers, found steady work creating the statues, reliefs, and burial goods needed for royal and elite tombs. Work that required tremendous patience and precision, values that seem to run through so much of Egyptian craftsmanship from this era. Toward the end of the Old Kingdom, during the long reign of a king named Pepi II, historians observe signs of gradual strain within the kingdom. Some scholars point to evidence of lower Nile flood levels during this period, which may have reduced agricultural yields and placed pressure on the kingdom's resources. Others point to the growing power of regional governors, known as nomarchs, whose increasing independence from central authority may have gradually weakened the pharaoh's control over the wider kingdom. As with so much of this story, the true causes were likely a slow combination of several factors working together, rather than any single dramatic event. By the end of the 6th dynasty, the centralized authority that had defined the Old Kingdom for so long had begun to fade, ushering in a quieter, more fragmented period that historians call the First Intermediate Period, which we will explore gently in our next segment. But before we move on, it is worth pausing once more at Giza, picturing the pyramids as they stood when they were new, their outer surfaces covered in smooth, polished white limestone casing stones, catching the light of the setting sun across the desert plateau. Beneath them, the Nile continued its familiar rhythm, rising and falling with the seasons, carrying boats loaded with stone and grain, entirely unconcerned with the enormous monuments now rising along its western bank. Monuments that would go on to outlast every kingdom, every dynasty, and every ruler who would ever ordinarily care to build something meant to last forever. After the long and steady building projects of the Old Kingdom, our slow journey along the Nile brings us now to a quieter, more uncertain stretch of Egyptian history, a period historians generally refer to as the First Intermediate Period. This span of time, lasting roughly a century and a half, is often described in older histories as a time of chaos and collapse, though more recent, careful study suggests a gentler and more nuanced picture, one of regional fragmentation and adjustment rather than sudden catastrophe. With the weakening of centralized royal authority that we touched on at the end of our previous segment, power across Egypt became increasingly distributed among regional governors, the nomarchs, each overseeing their own local territory along the Nile, rather than a single pharaoh ruling from one capital. Different regions of Egypt operated with a greater degree of independence, sometimes even recognizing different, competing lines of kings, claiming authority from different cities. Two centers in particular rose to prominence during this fragmented period. In the north, a line of rulers governed from a city called Heracleopolis, while in the south, a rival line of rulers governed from Thebes, a city that, though relatively modest at this point in its history, would go on to become one of the most important cities in all of Egypt in the centuries that followed. For a time, these two centers of power coexisted, each controlling a portion of the Nile Valley, with the exact boundary between their territories shifting gradually over the decades. Despite the political fragmentation of this period, life along the Nile continued in much the same way it always had for ordinary Egyptians. Farmers still planted their fields after the flood receded. Villages still produced pottery, wove textiles, and traded goods along the river. In fact, some historians point out that this period may have seen an increase in local artistic expression and regional identity, as communities no longer centered entirely around a single royal court began to develop their own distinct styles in tomb decoration, literature, and craftsmanship. Gradually, over the course of many decades, the rulers of Thebes in the south began to grow in strength and influence, eventually challenging and ultimately overcoming their rivals in the north. A Theban ruler named Mentuhotep II is generally credited with reuniting Egypt under a single rule once again. Sometime around 4,000 years before our own time, marking the beginning of what historians call the Middle Kingdom, a period often remembered as a golden age of stability, artistic achievement, and careful, deliberate governance. Under Mentuhotep and the rulers who followed him, Egypt entered a period of renewed prosperity. Irrigation systems along the Nile were expanded and improved, allowing more land to be brought under cultivation and helping to stabilize the food supply against the natural variation of the annual flood. One particularly notable project involved the region around the Fayum, a natural depression west of the Nile connected to the river by a channel, where extensive irrigation work transformed marshland into fertile, productive farmland, supporting new towns and settlements. The Middle Kingdom is also remembered as a particularly rich period for Egyptian literature. It was during this time that many works considered classics of Egyptian writing were composed, including stories, instructional texts, and poetry that would continue to be copied and studied by Egyptian scribes for many centuries afterward, long after the Middle Kingdom itself had ended. These texts offer us a gentle window into the values and concerns of the time, often emphasizing themes of order, wisdom, moderation, and the importance of maintaining harmony between people and the natural world around them. An idea the Egyptians called Mot. Mot is a concept worth pausing on for a moment, as it runs quietly through so much of Egyptian thought during this era and beyond. Mot represented truth, balance, and cosmic order, the underlying harmony that held the universe together. And it was considered the pharaoh's sacred responsibility to uphold and protect this order throughout the land. The alternative to Mot was Isfet, chaos or disorder. And much of Egyptian religious and political life during the Middle Kingdom can be understood as an ongoing, careful effort to preserve balance and prevent a slide back into the kind of fragmentation that had characterized the earlier intermediate period. Trade also expanded significantly during the Middle Kingdom, with Egyptian rulers establishing stronger connections with regions to the south, including Nubia, and to the east, including parts of the Near East. Fortresses were built along Egypt's southern border, near the Nile's second cataract, helping to secure trade routes and protect against incursions, while also facilitating the exchange of goods like gold, ivory, and exotic woods, flowing north from Nubia into Egypt proper. Religious practices during the Middle Kingdom also continued to evolve gradually. The god Osiris, associated with death, resurrection, and the afterlife, grew significantly in popularity during this period, with his worship becoming increasingly central to how ordinary Egyptians, not just pharaohs, understood what might happen to them after death. Funerary texts and practices that had once been reserved almost exclusively for royalty began to spread more broadly among Egyptian society, reflecting a gradual, gentle democratization of religious and afterlife beliefs that had once belonged only to kings. As the Middle Kingdom continued through the 12th dynasty, under a series of capable rulers who shared the names Senusret and Amenemhat, Egypt experienced a long stretch of relative peace, careful administration, and steady building projects, including temples, fortresses, and irrigation works that would benefit the kingdom for generations. It was, in many ways, a quieter counterpart to the dramatic pyramid building of the Old Kingdom, a period defined less by monumental scale and more by careful, patient governance and cultural refinement. As this long and gentle period gradually drew toward its close, toward the end of the 12th and into the 13th dynasty, central authority once again began to weaken slowly, opening the door to another intermediate period, a time when foreign peoples from the east, known as the Hyksos, would come to settle and eventually rule over parts of northern Egypt. We will explore that chapter and the new kingdom that eventually rose from it in the segment that follows. For now, we can simply rest in the quiet achievements of the Middle Kingdom, a time remembered less for grand monuments and more for careful balance, literature, and the patient, steady maintenance of order along the banks of a river that continued, as always, to rise and fall with the seasons. Our journey along the Nile now brings us to a period historians call the New Kingdom, often remembered as the height of ancient Egyptian power, wealth, and international influence. But before this golden age could begin, Egypt first passed through another quieter, more fragmented chapter, one we will move through gently before settling into the richer story that follows. Toward the end of the Middle Kingdom, as central authority in Egypt gradually weakened once again, a group of people from the eastern Mediterranean region, whom the Egyptians called the Hyksos, began to settle in the eastern Nile Delta. Over time, the Hyksos grew in influence, eventually establishing their own ruling dynasty over parts of northern Egypt, while native Egyptian rulers continued to govern from Thebes in the south. This period, known as the Second Intermediate Period, lasted roughly a century and saw Egypt once again divided between different centers of power, much as it had been during the earlier Intermediate Period we discussed previously. The Hyksos brought with them a number of new technologies and practices that would go on to have a lasting impact on Egyptian civilization, including the horse-drawn chariot, the composite bow, and new techniques in bronze working, rather than being remembered purely as conquerors. Historians increasingly understand the Hyksos period as one of cultural exchange, however uneven, that ultimately left Egypt with new tools and techniques that would prove useful in the centuries that followed. Eventually, rulers from Thebes, beginning with a king named Seqenenre-Tau, and continuing through his successors, Kamos and Amos, gradually pushed back against Hyksos control, eventually reunifying Egypt under native rule once again. Amos's success in expelling the Hyksos and reuniting the kingdom sometime around 3,500 years before our own time is generally considered the beginning of the New Kingdom, a period that would last for approximately 500 years and see Egypt rise to its greatest extent of wealth, territory, and influence. With reunification came a renewed sense of confidence, and Egyptian rulers began looking outward, beyond their own borders, in ways they had not done as extensively before. Military campaigns extended Egyptian influence south into Nubia and northeast into the Levant, bringing tribute, resources, and diplomatic relationships that connected Egypt more closely with the wider ancient world than at any previous point in its history. It was during this early New Kingdom period that one of the most remarkable rulers in Egyptian history came to power, a woman named Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut began her rule as regent for her young stepson, Thutmose III, but gradually took on the full authority and titles of pharaoh herself, ruling Egypt in her own right for approximately 2 decades. Her reign is remembered as a time of peace, prosperity, and extensive building projects, including her stunning mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, built into the cliffs across the river from Thebes. Its long terraces and colonnades designed to blend gracefully into the surrounding landscape. One of the most celebrated achievements of Hatshepsut's reign was a major trading expedition to a distant land the Egyptians called Punt. Likely located somewhere along the coast of the Red Sea, in the region of modern-day Eritrea, Djibouti, or Somalia, though its exact location remains a subject of gentle scholarly debate. This expedition, carefully recorded in relief carvings on the walls of her mortuary temple, brought back valuable goods, including myrrh trees, ebony, ivory, gold, and exotic animals, and it stands as one of the best documented examples of long-distance trade in the ancient world. After Hatshepsut's death, her stepson Thutmose III assumed full control of Egypt and went on to become one of the most militarily successful pharaohs in Egyptian history, leading numerous campaigns into the Levant and expanding Egyptian influence and control further than it had ever reached before. Despite the military nature of many of his campaigns, it is worth noting, in keeping with the calm tone of our story tonight, that these events are best understood as part of a broader pattern of ancient state building and diplomacy, involving alliances, tribute systems, and administrative organization, rather than being defined solely by conflict. The wealth generated by this expanded influence flowed back into Egypt in the form of gold, resources, and tribute, funding an extraordinary period of temple building, particularly at Thebes, which had by this point become the religious, and for much of the year, political heart of the kingdom. The temple complex at Karnak, dedicated primarily to the god Amun, who had risen to become the preeminent deity of the new kingdom, grew steadily over many generations, with successive pharaohs adding their own halls, pylons, obelisks, and statues, until it became one of the largest religious complexes ever constructed in the ancient world. Daily religious life during the New Kingdom also became increasingly structured around Amun and his priesthood, which grew tremendously wealthy and influential as royal patronage flowed toward Karnak and other temples across the kingdom. This concentration of religious wealth and power would eventually become significant in the political and religious changes that unfolded a little later in the New Kingdom, changes we will explore gently in our next segment. For ordinary Egyptians during this golden age, life continued along much the same rhythms that had shaped the Nile Valley for centuries: planting and harvest, flood and recession, but touched now by an increased sense of prosperity and connection to a wider world. Goods from distant lands, exotic woods, spices, and materials made their way into Egyptian markets and workshops. Artists and craftspeople produced work of extraordinary refinement, and the tombs of officials from this period, richly decorated with scenes of daily life, hunting, feasting, and family gatherings, offer us a warm and detailed window into how people during this era understood and celebrated their own lives. As we let this segment settle gently to a close, we might picture the Nile at Thebes during this golden age, wide and calm, lined with temple complexes, catching the late afternoon light, boats carrying grain and tribute, moving steadily along the water. And beyond the cultivated fields, the quiet hills where the pharaohs of this era were beginning to choose a new, more hidden resting place for their tombs. A valley we will visit gently in the segment that follows. As our slow journey continues through the New Kingdom, we come now to one of the more unusual and gently debated chapters in ancient Egyptian history, a period of religious change centered around a pharaoh named Amenhotep IV, who would later become known to history as Akhenaten. Amenhotep IV came to power several generations after Thutmose III, inheriting a kingdom that was, by this point, extraordinarily wealthy and stable, with a religious establishment centered around the god Amun at Karnak that had grown enormously powerful over the preceding century. It was against this backdrop that Amenhotep introduced a striking religious shift, one that would set his reign apart from nearly every other period in Egyptian history. Rather than continuing to honor the traditional array of Egyptian gods, Amenhotep began to elevate a single deity, the Aten, represented as the visible disk of the sun itself, above all others. Over the course of his reign, this shift became increasingly pronounced, until the worship of other traditional gods was actively discouraged, and in some cases, their names and images were even removed from temple walls and monuments across the kingdom. To reflect this new devotion, Amenhotep changed his own name to Akhenaten, meaning something like effective for the Aten, or living spirit of the Aten. Alongside this religious transformation, Akhenaten made another remarkable decision, moving Egypt's religious and administrative center away from Thebes entirely to a newly built city on a stretch of previously undeveloped land along the Nile, roughly halfway between Thebes and Memphis. This new city, called Akhetaten, meaning horizon of the Aten, and known today by its modern name, Amarna, was constructed relatively quickly and became the center of religious and political life for the remainder of Akhenaten's reign. It is worth picturing this city as it may have looked during its short but vivid existence. Wide open temple courtyards, unlike the more enclosed, roofed temples of traditional Egyptian worship, designed instead to let sunlight pour directly onto altars in continuous devotion to the sun disk above. Elegant palaces, gardens, and residential districts spread along the riverbank, home for a period to a significant portion of Egypt's royal court, administrators, and craftspeople, all relocated to this new center built specifically around Akhenaten's religious vision. Alongside Akhenaten throughout much of this period was his principal wife, Nefertiti, whose name and image appear frequently throughout the art of this era. She is depicted, unusually for an Egyptian queen, taking part in religious ceremonies alongside her husband in ways that suggest she held a position of significant influence and importance during this period. And some artistic depictions from Amarna even show her in poses more commonly reserved for pharaohs themselves. The art produced during this period, now known as the Amarna style, also represents a notable departure from earlier Egyptian artistic tradition. Figures, including the royal family, are often depicted with more naturalistic, sometimes even exaggerated physical features, softer curves, elongated forms, and unusually intimate family scenes showing Akhenaten and Nefertiti with their daughters in relaxed, affectionate poses. Quite different from the formal, idealized imagery typically used to depict Egyptian royalty in earlier periods. Despite the vividness and apparent devotion behind this religious and artistic shift, it did not last long beyond Akhenaten's own lifetime. After his death, the throne passed briefly to a successor, whose identity remains a subject of gentle scholarly discussion, before eventually reaching a young boy who would become one of the most famous names in all of Egyptian history, Tutankhamun. Tutankhamun, who came to the throne as a child, likely no older than 9 years old, reigned for approximately a decade before his own early death. During his reign, under the guidance of his advisors, Egypt gradually returned to its traditional religious practices, honoring Amun and the wider pantheon of Egyptian gods once again. And the royal court moved back to Thebes and Memphis, leaving the city of Akhetaten to be gradually abandoned over the following years. Tutankhamun's own reign, in the broader context of Egyptian history, was relatively unremarkable in terms of major political or military events. His lasting fame today comes almost entirely from the extraordinary preservation and discovery of his tomb in the Valley of the Kings, found remarkably intact in the early 20th century, filled with an overwhelming wealth of golden objects, jewelry, furniture, and funerary equipment that offer us one of the most detailed windows we have into royal burial practices and material culture from this era of Egyptian history. The Amarna period as a whole is often described by historians as a fascinating but ultimately temporary departure from the broader continuity of Egyptian religious and cultural tradition. Within a generation or two after Akhenaten's death, efforts were made to restore traditional practices fully, and later king lists, compiled by Egyptian scribes, sometimes omitted Akhenaten's name entirely, along with those of his immediate successors, suggesting a deliberate effort to smooth over this unusual chapter and restore a sense of continuity with the longer, more traditional arc of Egyptian religious history. As we let this segment come gently to close, we might picture the city of Amarna as it stands today, largely returned to the quiet desert from which it was built, its temple foundations outlined faintly in the sand, the Nile continuing to flow past just as it always has, carrying with it the memory of a brief, unusual, and deeply devoted period when, for a short time, an entire kingdom turned its attention toward a single disk of sunlight rising each morning over the eastern hills. Following the quiet restoration of traditional religious practice after the Amarna period, Egypt entered into what many historians consider the final and most expansive flourishing of the New Kingdom, a period dominated by a new line of pharaohs known as the Ramesside kings, named after the several rulers who took the name Ramesses during this era. The founder of this new royal line was a man named Ramesses I, who came to the throne later in life after a career as a military official and vizier under earlier New Kingdom rulers. His reign was brief, but it established a new dynasty, the 19th, that would go on to include some of the most well-remembered pharaohs in all of Egyptian history, including his son Seti I and his grandson, the long-reigning Ramesses II. Seti I continued the process of restoring and expanding Egypt's temples following the disruptions of the Amarna period, undertaking significant building projects, including a beautifully decorated temple at Abydos, one of ancient Egypt's most sacred cities, long associated with the god Osiris and the mythology surrounding death and rebirth. Seti also began construction of what would become one of the largest halls ever built in ancient Egypt, the Great Hypostyle Hall at Karnak, filled with rows of massive stone columns so large that several people together could not fully wrap their arms around a single one. It was Seti's son, Ramesses II, who would go on to become perhaps the most famous pharaoh in all of Egyptian history, ruling for an extraordinarily long 66 years, a reign so lengthy that by the time of his death, many of his own subjects would have known no other ruler in their entire lifetime. Ramesses II, sometimes remembered by the title Ramesses the Great, presided over an era defined by extensive building projects, careful diplomacy, and a strong, stable central government that allowed Egyptian civilization to flourish across the length of the Nile Valley. Among Ramesses's many building achievements, perhaps none is more visually striking than the temples he constructed at Abu Simbel, far to the south in Nubia, near Egypt's southern border. Carved directly into a sandstone cliff face, the great temple at Abu Simbel features 4 colossal seated statues of Ramesses himself, each one over 20 meters tall, gazing out toward the Nile. Nearby, a smaller temple was dedicated to his favored wife, Nefertari, an unusually rare honor in Egyptian tradition, where the queen's statues stand at the same height as those of the king himself, suggesting the deep esteem in which she was held. Ramesses's reign was not without conflict, though even here, our story can move through this chapter calmly and factually. Early in his reign, Ramesses led a significant military campaign against the Hittite Empire, a powerful rival civilization based in what is now central Turkey, culminating in a large battle near the city of Kadesh along the Orontes River. Both Egyptian and Hittite records describe this engagement, though, as is often the case with ancient accounts of the same event, their descriptions differ somewhat in the details, and the battle itself appears to have ended without a clear victory for either side. What followed the Battle of Kadesh, however, stands as one of the more remarkable achievements of ancient diplomacy. Roughly 15 years after the battle, Ramesses and the Hittite king, Hattusili III, negotiated a formal peace treaty between their two empires, often described as one of the earliest known peace treaties in recorded history. Copies of this treaty survive both in Egyptian hieroglyphic inscriptions and in Hittite cuneiform tablets, and a replica of the treaty text is displayed today at the headquarters of the United Nations. A quiet reminder of how ancient this practice of formal diplomatic peacemaking truly is. Beyond his military and diplomatic activities, Ramesses II undertook building projects across nearly every major city in Egypt. He completed the great hypostyle hall his father had begun at Karnak, added extensively to temples throughout Thebes, and constructed an enormous new capital city in the eastern Nile Delta, called Ramesses, meaning the house of Ramesses, which became one of the largest and most prosperous cities in the ancient world during his reign. Positioned to help manage Egypt's growing connections with the Near East, for ordinary Egyptians living during the long reign of Ramesses II, daily life continued to follow the familiar rhythms established over the many centuries we have already followed together. Flood and planting, harvest and rest, the steady work of farming, craft, and trade along the riverbanks. The extended stability of this long reign allowed for significant economic prosperity, with trade networks reaching from Nubia in the south to the Near East in the northeast, bringing gold, timber, spices, and countless other goods into Egyptian markets and workshops. After Ramesses II's death, having outlived many of his own children, the throne passed through a series of successors, including his 13th son, Merneptah, and continued through the remainder of the 19th dynasty and into the 20th dynasty, which included several more pharaohs who also took the name Ramesses, following in the tradition established by their great predecessor. Among these later rulers, Ramesses III is particularly remembered for successfully defending Egypt against a series of invasions by groups historians collectively refer to as the Sea Peoples, a loosely connected coalition whose origins and identity remain only partially understood, but whose incursions affected much of the eastern Mediterranean world during this period. As we let this long and richly built chapter come to a gentle close, we might picture the Nile as it flowed during the height of Ramesses II's reign, lined with temples, obelisks, and colossal statues from Abu Simbel in the far south all the way to Ramesses in the delta. Boats carrying goods and officials steadily up and down its length. The entire valley humming quietly with the settled, confident rhythm of a civilization at the height of its long and patient development. As we continue our unhurried journey along the Nile, we arrive now at a long and gradual chapter in Egyptian history, one that unfolded not as a single dramatic ending, but as a slow, uneven fading of the centralized power and wealth that had defined the new kingdom for so many centuries. Historians often refer to this broad span of time as the Third Intermediate Period and the Late Period, together covering close to 1,000 years of gradual transition. Following the reign of Ramesses III and the later Ramesside kings, Egypt's central authority began to weaken once again, in a pattern that, by this point in our story, may feel familiar. Regional governors and the powerful priesthood of Amen at Thebes gradually accumulated more independent authority, while in the north, a series of kings ruled from cities in the Nile Delta. For a time, Egypt was effectively divided between a religious and political authority centered in the south and separate ruling dynasties in the north, echoing, in a gentler way, the divisions we saw during earlier intermediate periods. During this long period, Egypt also experienced rule by several dynasties of foreign origin, each bringing their own perspectives and practices, while, in most cases, also adopting and continuing many traditional Egyptian customs, religious practices, and building projects. Among the more notable of these was a dynasty of Nubian kings from the kingdom of Kush to the south, who came to rule over Egypt during the 8th century before our own era, in what is now called the 25th dynasty. The Nubian pharaohs of this period, including rulers such as Pe and Taharka, saw themselves not as foreign conquerors, but as restorers of proper, traditional Egyptian religious practice, which they believed had fallen into neglect under the fragmented rule that preceded them. They undertook significant temple building and restoration projects, particularly at Thebes, and their rule is remembered by many historians as a period of genuine reverence for and careful continuation of long-standing Egyptian religious and cultural traditions, even as it came from a kingdom to the south that had itself been deeply influenced by Egyptian civilization for centuries. Nubian rule over Egypt eventually came to an end following a series of conflicts with the expanding Assyrian Empire, based in Mesopotamia, which invaded Egypt during the 7th century before our own era. Following a period of Assyrian influence, a new native Egyptian dynasty, the 26th, centered in the Delta city of Sais, managed to reassert Egyptian independence, ushering in a period sometimes called the Sate Renaissance, during which Egyptian art, religion, and culture experienced a deliberate revival, often looking back consciously to the styles and traditions of the Old and Middle Kingdoms as a source of inspiration and continuity. This period of renewed independence, however, would ultimately prove to be one of the final chapters of native Egyptian rule for a very long time. In the late 6th century before our era, the Persian Empire, under King Cambyses II, conquered Egypt, incorporating it as a province within the vast and expanding Persian Empire. Egypt would remain under Persian control, with occasional periods of native rebellion and brief independence. For roughly the following 2 centuries, a long stretch during which Egyptian civilization continued, in many ways, to maintain its own religious and cultural identity, even while under the political authority of a foreign empire. It is worth pausing here gently to reflect on how a civilization can continue to exist, continue to build temples, continue to practice its traditions, even while no longer governed by rulers of its own choosing. Throughout the periods of foreign rule we have just described, Nubian, Assyrian-influenced, and Persian, Egyptian temples continued to be built and maintained. Egyptian religious festivals continued to be celebrated, and the Nile continued its same familiar rhythm of flood and harvest that had shaped life in this valley for thousands of years before any of these foreign powers had ever arrived. This long period of change came to a significant turning point in the year 332 before our own era, when Alexander the Great, having already conquered much of the Persian Empire, arrived in Egypt and was welcomed, according to ancient accounts, largely as a liberator freeing the country from Persian rule. Alexander was crowned pharaoh according to traditional Egyptian custom, and during his brief time in Egypt, he founded a new city along the Mediterranean coast that would bear his name, Alexandria, a city that would go on to become one of the great centers of learning, culture, and trade in the ancient world for many centuries to come. Following Alexander's death just a few years later, his vast empire was divided among his generals, and Egypt fell under the control of one of them, a man named Ptolemy, who established a new ruling dynasty, the Ptolemaic dynasty, that would govern Egypt for close to 300 years, a period we will explore gently in our final segment together. As this long, slow chapter of transition and foreign rule draws to its close, we might picture the Nile continuing its steady, unhurried flow through all of these changes. Past temples built by Nubian kings, past cities influenced by Assyrian and Persian administration, past the new gleaming harbor of Alexandria taking shape along the Mediterranean coast. Dynasties rose and dynasties faded. Foreign powers arrived and foreign powers departed. And through it all, the river continued exactly as it always had, patient, steady, indifferent to the passing concerns of empire, and endlessly generous to the people who continued to live and farm and build gently along its banks. We arrive now at the final stretch of our long journey along the Nile, a chapter that brings the story of ancient Egypt as an independent civilization gently to its close. This is the story of the Ptolemaic period and of the last individual to rule Egypt as pharaoh in the ancient tradition. before the country became part of a much larger empire that would carry it into an entirely new chapter of its long history. As we touched on at the end of our previous segment, following the death of Alexander the Great, one of his trusted generals, Ptolemy, took control of Egypt and established a new ruling family, one that would govern the country for close to 3 centuries. What makes the Ptolemaic period particularly interesting is the way it blended Greek and Egyptian traditions together, sometimes smoothly, and sometimes with visible tension between the two cultures existing side by side along the Nile. The Ptolemaic rulers, though of Greek origin, generally embraced many traditional Egyptian religious practices, presenting themselves to their Egyptian subjects as legitimate pharaohs in the ancient style, building and restoring temples across the country, and supporting Egyptian priesthoods, much as native rulers had done for thousands of years before them. At the same time, the new capital city, Alexandria, founded by Alexander along the Mediterranean coast, developed as a distinctly Greek city, becoming one of the greatest centers of learning and scholarship in the entire ancient world. Alexandria during this period was home to the famous Library of Alexandria, an institution that aimed to gather and preserve written knowledge from across the known world, drawing scholars, scientists, and philosophers from many different cultures to study, write, and exchange ideas along its quiet halls and gardens. Alongside the library stood the Lighthouse of Alexandria, an enormous structure built on the small island of Pharos at the entrance to the city's harbor, which came to be regarded as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, guiding ships safely toward the coast with its light for many centuries. Throughout the Ptolemaic period, life along the rest of the Nile Valley continued in much the same rhythm it always had, shaped by the same annual flood, the same patterns of planting and harvest, even as the political and cultural center of the country increasingly oriented itself toward the Mediterranean world and the wider Hellenistic sphere that connected Egypt to Greece and the broader Eastern Mediterranean. The Ptolemaic dynasty is perhaps best remembered today through its final and most famous ruler, Cleopatra VII, who came to the throne in the year 51 before our own era. Cleopatra was, by most historical accounts, a remarkably capable and well-educated ruler, said to have been fluent in multiple languages, including Egyptian itself, a distinction rare among her predominantly Greek-speaking predecessors, and one that likely helped her connect more directly with her Egyptian subjects than many of the Ptolemaic rulers before her. Cleopatra's reign coincided with a period of significant political change within the wider Mediterranean world. As the Roman Republic, having grown enormously powerful, increasingly extended its influence into the affairs of neighboring kingdoms, including Egypt. Cleopatra formed political alliances, first with the Roman general Julius Caesar, and later with Mark Antony. Relationships that were, in part, efforts to preserve Egyptian independence amid the growing power of Rome, though they also drew Egypt directly into the internal political conflicts unfolding within Roman politics itself. Following Mark Antony's defeat by Octavian, who would later become the Roman Emperor Augustus, in a naval battle at Actium in the year 31 before our own era, Cleopatra's ability to maintain Egyptian independence came to its end. The following year, with Roman forces advancing into Egypt itself, Cleopatra's reign, and with it, the long, continuous line of pharaohs stretching back more than 3,000 years to Narmer, and the earliest unification of Upper and Lower Egypt came to its close. Egypt was absorbed into the Roman Empire as a province, and it would not be governed as an independent country again for close to 2,000 years. It is worth taking a quiet moment here to consider the extraordinary span of time we have traveled together across these 10 segments, from the earliest farming villages along the Nile's fertile banks, through the unification of two lands into one, through the age of pyramid building, through golden ages and quiet intermediate periods, through religious transformation and diplomatic peace treaties, through centuries of foreign rule gently woven into continuing tradition, and finally to Cleopatra and the absorption of Egypt into the Roman world. We have followed a story spanning more than 3,000 years, a length of time so vast that it is genuinely difficult for the mind to hold all at once. And yet, even after the end of pharaonic rule, Egyptian civilization did not simply disappear. Egyptian religious practices, temple worship, and cultural traditions continued for several more centuries under Roman rule, gradually blending with and eventually giving way to new religious and cultural changes. As the wider Mediterranean world itself continued to transform in the centuries that followed, the temples along the Nile continued to stand, weathering slowly under the same sun that had watched over them since they were first built. Monuments to a civilization that had, for longer than almost any other in human history, found a way to live in steady, patient partnership with a single, life-giving river. As we bring this long journey to its gentle close, we return, one final time, to the image with which we began. The Nile, quiet and steady, moving northward from distant highlands and lakes, spreading its dark, fertile soil across the valley floor each year, indifferent to kingdoms and empires, indifferent to pharaohs and conquerors, continuing its same patient rhythm long after the last pyramid was built, long after the last hieroglyph was carved, and continuing still today, flowing gently past the temples, the tombs, and the quiet desert sands that hold, within them, the long, slow memory of everything we have followed together tonight. Rest now, if you have not already. The river will keep flowing, exactly as it always has, whether we are here to watch it or not.